I'm Charlie. Today, I've got 8 phrasal verbs that you can use in a formal business meeting. Hi, I'm Charlie. Welcome to Organic English. I'm here to help you become more fluent in English. Now, I'll put a link to a transcript in the description below. You can download that for free to help you follow along with this lesson. Now, when you're sitting in a business meeting that's in English, do you sometimes feel lost? Do you feel that you don't understand and that your vocabulary could be more advanced so that you could participate more? Well, today I'm going to help you fight that feeling. I'm going to go through 8 phrasal verbs that you can use in a formal business meeting. First, I'm going to go through a quick recap of what phrasal verbs are. Secondly, I'm going to go through why we need to learn them. After that, we'll go through the best way to learn them. And then I'm going to present a short real-life monologue taken from a real business meeting. The monologue will contain the 8 phrasal verbs, and after the dialogue, I'll go through the meanings of the phrasal verbs, and I'll give you a couple of extra examples to make sure that you understand. Now, another part of successfully remembering vocabulary is to use it. So feel free to make your own sentences with these phrasal verbs and put them in the comments below, and I'll check them out. Does that sound good? Now, if you want to jump straight to the phrasal verbs, check in the chapters below and go ahead and do that. As ever, I'm going to present these phrasal verbs in a real-life context. In this case, in the context of a business meeting. But of course, you can use these phrasal verbs in many other contexts. I'll give you examples outside of the business world too to help you do that. So first things first, let's review what phrasal verbs are. Now, phrasal verbs are phrases, and they're made with a verb and 1 or sometimes 2 other words. These other words are usually an adverb or preposition. Now, phrasal verbs are tricky and intimidating because the meaning is idiomatic. We cannot work out the meaning of the phrasal verb from the individual words that make up that phrase. As an example, a really common phrasal verb is work out. I prefer to work out in the morning before my day gets busy. Now, many phrasal verbs, most phrasal verbs have multiple meanings. But in this context, work out means to do exercises to make your body stronger. But as you know, work most commonly means to do a job that you're paid for. For example, I work at Starbucks. Out most commonly is used to show movement away from the inside of a place or a container. For example, he dropped the box and all the apples fell out. Now, as you can see, the meaning of the phrase is different from the meaning of those individual words. So it's hard for any learner to figure out the meaning of the phrase from the individual words that make up that phrase. The meaning of that phrase has just become accepted by English speakers by being used over and over. And that's why we need to learn them, because we use phrasal verbs all the time. If you don't want to feel lost in a business meeting, if you want to be able to understand proficient English speakers better, if you want to take your spoken English to the next level, then learning more phrasal verbs will help you reach this goal. It's also important to be able to use phrasal verbs correctly if you want to score a 7.0 and above in your IELTS speaking test as well. So that's why. What is the best way to learn them? As I mentioned with my first example, work out, phrasal verbs can have multiple meanings. Work out, for example, can mean to do exercises to make your body stronger, as I mentioned. We can also say that if a problem works out, it gradually becomes better. For example, don't worry, everything will work out in the end. Work out can also mean to deal with a problem in a satisfactory way. Don't worry, we've worked out our differences. It can also mean to solve a problem by doing a calculation. I was born in 1970. You work out my age. And that's just a few of them. So clearly, memorizing a list of phrasal verbs out of context is how not to learn them. What's much more effective is to learn them in the different settings that you find them. If the setting the context is familiar, the phrasal verb will be easier to understand and easier to remember. That's why I prefer to teach phrasal verbs in different real life situations, in different real life contexts. Now this does three things. Firstly, it shows you that phrasal verbs are a normal part of English, that they are part of our day-to-day conversation. Secondly, you're much less likely to get overwhelmed by too many phrasal verbs at one time. And thirdly, it allows you to practice using those phrasal verbs in the correct context. Okay, so let's get on to those 8 phrasal verbs I promised you. Here I'm presenting the phrasal verbs to you in the context of a business meeting where the presenter is outlining the subjects and the topics that will be covered in that meeting. Okay, so the phrasal verbs we're going to be covering today are get through something, bring up, get onto, run through, leave something aside, come back to, spell something out, deal with. Listen out for those 8 phrasal verbs, okay? Good morning, everyone. Now, we have a lot to get through this morning, so I won't delay. There are a couple of points which I want to bring up for discussion in this meeting. Just before we get onto those matters, I'd like to run through the schedule for next week's conference, which you should all have copies of. Now, I know that Jack asked that we talk about the new branding, but I'd prefer to leave that aside for today and come back to it when we have a little more time. Now, I'm sure I don't need to spell out how important it is that we're all thoroughly prepared for next week's conference. So let's deal with that first. Okay, so let's run through each of those sentences. Now, we have a lot to get through this morning. Get through something. This means to finish or complete a task. For example, there was a lot to get through in the meeting. We've got a lot of work to get through before the end of this class. Next sentence. There are a couple of points which I want to bring up for discussion in this meeting. Bring up. Bring up, this means to mention a subject or to start to talk about it. Here's an example. Imagine you're going to dinner at a friend's house. Hey, we'd like to have a nice evening, okay? Please don't bring up her ex-husband. This one is separable. That means you can put another word between bring and up. So you can also say, I hate to bring this up, but you still owe me $50. Next sentence. Just before we get onto those matters, get onto. This has a similar meaning to bring something up. It means to begin talking about a subject after you've been discussing something else. Here's an example. Okay, let's get on to the next item on our agenda. How do we get onto this subject? Next sentence. I'd like to run through the schedule for next week's conference. Run through. This means to explain or to read something quickly. For example, okay, I'll just run through the names and make sure everyone's here. Do you want me to run through the details with you? Next sentence. Now, I know that Jack asked that we talk about the new branding, but I'd prefer to leave that aside for today. Leave something aside. This means to not think about or consider one part of something for a time, so you can consider another part. An example. Can you two just leave aside your differences for now and get this done, please? I'm going to leave the prepositions aside for now and focus on the tenses. Okay, next sentence. And come back to it when we have a little more time. Come back to something. This means to deal again with something that you were dealing with earlier. An example. Could we come back to my original question? Don't worry, I'm going to come back to the tenses in the next session. Next sentence. Now, I'm sure I don't need to spell out how important it is. Spell something out. Now, this means to explain something clearly and in detail. For example, sorry, but could you spell out your exact plan for us? It doesn't really seem to make sense. I find the course book spells out everything very carefully. Now this one is also separable, so you could say, I understand. You don't have to spell it out again. Next sentence. So let's deal with that first. Deal with something. This means to take action to do something, especially to solve a problem. For example, I spent the whole morning dealing with my emails. Don't worry, I'll deal with this. So, good work. 8 phrasal verbs that you can use in a formal business meeting. Now, as ever, I encourage you to learn, practice, and review any kind of vocabulary in context. This will definitely help you retain it more effectively, and you'll be able to produce it more easily when the time comes. So, to recap, those 8 phrasal verbs were: get through something, bring up, get onto, run through, leave something aside, come back to, spell something out, and deal with. Don't forget, make your own example sentences with these phrasal verbs, put them in the comments below, and I'll check them out for you. There's also a link to a transcript in the description below. Download that for free and use it to follow along with this lesson. You can also go to my website, www.organicenglish.club, where there's plenty of other material to help you become more fluent. Thank you very much for watching. Now go out and practice your phrasal verbs.